Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, for Louisianians, the query, is there a doctor in the House, can be answered by saying, yes, there are 3 of them, plus 1 in the Senate. A new Congress was sworn in this week and will take the pulse of the state's new delegation, plus measure the temperature on the Steve Scalise controversy. We'll also look at gay marriages and the courts, the decline in the local murder rate, and what to expect this carnival season. On the floor for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; Clancy Dubos, political editor, Gambit newspaper; Naomi Martin, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune; and Stephanie Grace, columnist, the New Orleans Advocate. First over to Clancy and the Steve Scalise issue. That just won't completely die down.
Not quite, but to cut to the chase, I think Scalise has survived this. Not because he was so masterful in how he handled it. He did some things right. I think he did some things wrong. The one thing he did right pretty early on, he admitted that he went there and he said this was a mistake. And that's very important for politicians to do. Most politicians are loath to admit that they made a mistake. He did admit it was a mistake. He went pretty deep in the weeds, I think, for a politician to say, look, this is not who I am. I don't believe in these groups. I renounce them. I'm not for them. You know, I went there to talk about taxes, et cetera, and spending and whatever. And he said, it was a mistake I regret. Now, that's not exactly a full-throated apology, the kind of mea culpa that Steve Scalise, as a Catholic, as he mentioned his religion and talked about how these kinds of groups are antithetical to his faith. But if you really want to be a Catholic, you go to confession and you say you're sorry. He didn't quite do that, but it seems to have satisfied most of the people. Certainly on Capitol Hill, saying I regret something counts for an apology. There's 2 different prisms that people are looking at this from. But I think unless something else comes out, then I think he's going to survive this. He's going to have some time in the penalty box, as it were, where he might not be the guy that they put out there on the Sunday morning talk shows. He's not going to be the front and center fundraiser, although he has one coming up because it was already scheduled. But he's not going to be the face guy for the GOP for a few months. But the good news for him, Washington has a pretty fast track on rehabilitation. There are people who've done all sorts of things who come back in 2 or 3 months, and it's as if got absolution.
So what about his former neighbor's claim, Kenny Knight, who supposedly invited him to this organization? If you could quickly background us also, for maybe somebody who's missed the story over this past 2 weeks, of what is the controversy surrounding.
Well, Kenny Knight, we all know who David Duke is. David Duke, he founds these right-wing, neo-Nazi, racist hate groups, and one of them is called EURO, the European American Union for Unity and Rights Organization, European Americans for Unity and Rights Organization. It's a front group for Duke to spew his neo-Nazi stuff. Kenny Knight is Duke's wingman here in Louisiana. He's the guy who's, speaks for David Duke, communicates with him. Back in 2002, when Scalise was a 36-year-old, ambitious, young, not always thinking things through, state representative, and that's not a knock on him. Lots of, freshmen and sophomore state reps who are ambitious legislators and politicians, and who are 5 or 6 years in the public office. They don't always think things through. But Scalise knew who Kenny Knight was, and he knew what Kenny Knight's friendship with David Duke was. Kenny Knight was a neighbor, a former neighbor of Scalise, invited Scalise to speak to this group. Knight later said, no, I was actually inviting him to speak to the neighborhood association. That proved to not
be true. Yeah.
Nobody except Kenny Knight says it's true. But Stephanie wrote a column about this, and you should weigh in on it, because she wrote a great column about a statement that Scalise made to her when she first came to town, and Scalise was just getting into public office. Why don't you take it from there?
And we were sitting down. It was just a get-to-know-you session. I was new, he was new in the job, and he was really telling me about his politics. And he, of course, was a representative from Jefferson Parish. This would have been probably 95, 96, so a few years after Duke's peak, I guess. And what he said was, and I always remembered this, that he was like David Duke without the baggage, which is, something you remember, and, clearly the way people have quoted it, I think it struck a lot of other people the same way it struck me. I think what he was saying, I'm pretty sure what he was saying is, I am someone who can offer a similar ideology platform against affirmative action, just very conservative anti-tax, a lot of the issues that Duke talked about when he ran for governor, without being David Duke, without being a guy with a Klan background who was a neo-Nazi. It sounds, you know, I have to say...
It sounds terrible when you hear it.
It sounds terrible.
Well, let me offer something that a Republican, a former Republican state official, elected official that I know said. He said, you know, when Duke started trying to become legitimate, he said he grabbed all of our issues. We didn't grab his issues. He grabbed our issues and gave him a bad name because he's David Duke. He said, we were always anti-affirmative action. We were always conservative. We were always all these things. But when Duke put his name on it, it was horrible for the brand, as a one way to put it.
But this also gets to a problem that the Republicans have, which is why I think it's relevant now, why people are reacting the same way. They have a lot of trouble appealing to African-American voters. And there is a sentiment, I believe, that some of their policies are, you know, maybe biased, maybe just hostile, maybe insensitive. There are all different ways to interpret it. I mean, Steve Scalise was one of the few representatives who voted against a Martin Luther King holiday. Is that racist, or is that just kind of insensitive? You could argue it both ways, but you know, it's all part of the package.
Plus, if the Republican philosophy or whatever, if their platform was close enough that David Duke could grab it and feel so comfortable with it, that should be kind of a red flag too, at least back then, and it was. I mean, George H.W. Bush renounced David Duke back in 1989 when Duke was running for the State House of Representatives in an election that Errol and I covered very closely.
But if you are a Republican running specifically in Jefferson Parish in those days, the people who you need to vote for you are the people who voted for David Duke in some cases.
Or who agreed with him,
Or who agreed with him. I mean, he won public office.
Okay, Errol.
Well, just ask that or just throw a philosophical argument. The people who tend to win elections are the people who gravitate towards the middle in their party, whether they're the liberals or the conservatives. Isn't it good in the way that a democracy works that those people can interact with the fringes of their parties, with the far left or the far right, in terms of stabilizing them and being able to make them believe in the system?
I think that's part of Steve Scalise's argument now. Look, I was elected official. These people were in my district. I didn't vet them. I should have. It's a mistake I regret, was what he said. But I went there. And so it's to his credit that he's not running from it, although he kind of ran, and I say ran, he didn't show himself to the media right away, and I think that was a mistake. He kind of used the same tactic that David Vitter used when Vitter got caught in the prostitution scandal. That worked for Vitter, but Vitter was not the #3 man in the Senate. When you're that high profile, you got to get out in front of something, and it created a void, and guess who filled it? David Duke and Kenny Knight. That was horrible for Scalise and horrible for the Republican Party.
And there's one other thing here, and that one other aspect is that the Democrats are loving this, I have to say. I mean, because it helps them paint the Republicans the way they want to paint the Republicans. So they're going to keep talking about it,
But does this mean that for elected officials that there's going to always be a list of people who they should never speak to? Even if maybe they could go and speak to those people and convince them about something or change their minds. I mean, has that freedom of speech been denied to a certain extent?
I think it's a stretch to say there's no freedom of speech. It's a question of political nuances and political sensibilities. A politician and any human being has a choice. We have freedom of assembly under the First Amendment. The Euro and other hate groups have a right to assemble. The ACLU defended the KKK's right to parade. That's the First Amendment right of assembly. Whether you choose to go march in that parade says something about yourself.
Now, the congressman, of course, has renounced any sort of bigotry whatsoever. Right. And you're saying for right now, too, he seems safe in his position because he has the support of GOP
certainly
leadership.
Safe in his district, and probably safe in that. But you know what's interesting? When he said, I renounce all forms of bigotry, it took me a few days to remember why that statement was bouncing around in my head. Back when David Duke first got elected and was, making his big splash, he was trying to say, look, all that stuff in the past, that's part of my past. I and others asked him specifically, point blank, do you renounce Adolf Hitler? You know what he said? I renounce all forms of hatred. He never specifically renounced Adolf Hitler. Well, Steve Scalise never specifically and expressly renounced David Duke. I think it would help his cause if he would do that.
Quickly, are we going to continue to hear about this? Or
I think we will for a little while, but as long as nothing else comes out, it's already been bumped off page 1. There are terrorist attacks and everything else out there that are going to fill the void.
Okay, we have to move over now to our new congressional delegations, and we have doctors in the House and in the Senate.
We do. We have, it's remarkable, half of our delegation, a full half, made up of physicians. 3 out of 6 in the House, 1 out of 2 in the Senate. I think that means as they're all Republicans, so as the Republicans look at trying to play with the health care law, undo it or redo it, I think they will be major players. Certainly, Bill Cassidy has talked about doing that. Charles Bustani has. So it's an interesting delegation. The delegation is now all Republican, with one exception, Cedric Richmond, who, if we can go back to Scalise for a moment.
And all male.
All male, yes, definitely, for the first time in quite a long time. There's the state of Lindy Boggs and Mary Landrieu, but no more. Cedric Richmond, we should say, the only Democrat, is old friends with Steve Scalise from the legislature, came out and defended him immediately. He's an African-American Republican, and I think...
Democrat.
I'm sorry, Democrat, thank you. And I think he... First of all, he's earned himself some favors from Steve Scalise, but I think he will help Scalise survive this. Yes. Elsewhere, we have 2 new members in the House, Garrett Graves from Baton Rouge and Ralph Abraham from the Monroe area. Garrett Graves is a former aide to Bobby Jindal, Coastal Aid. What's interesting about him, I think, so far is he's getting some notice up in Washington for his stance on climate change, which, of course, many Republicans are saying that they don't believe in it. Garrett Graves oversaw the coastal plan for the state, where it actually was taken into consideration. So I think some of the Washington reporters are figuring out, you know what, he might actually think it's real, and asking him about it, which is putting him in a little bit of an interesting position.
To have him now in, go ahead. You have something? Yeah, no, go ahead.
So what did he say about climate change? Has he given a definitive position on it yet?
He said there are many factors. One of them is kind of probably human-made. That doesn't mean we should do something about it. He's dancing around it a little bit, but I think he is someone who is not going to have as easy a time as some other Republicans saying.
He also was on the staff of Billy Tozan for a while, so he kind of understands the way Washington works more than a rank freshman, as it were.
And David Vitter, for that matter.
Right, yeah. I mean, he definitely has some experience up there, and he also, as you pointed out, has great experience about our coast and trying to
which will be his big
mend
issue.
our coast. Yeah. Yes. So what do you think he will be doing now in Congress to make Congress more aware of what we are experiencing down here?
Well, he got some good committee assignments where he can talk about that issue. Of course, he's only a freshman, so there's only so much you can do. But I think he's in a position to try to direct some money, try to direct some resources, and direct the conversation, certainly, from a position of tremendous knowledge.
Okay. Before we move on to talk to Naomi about the reduced murder rate, I did want to ask you one thing, and that is regarding Judge Frank Marullo, who is at criminal court. He's handling cases, etc.
And he had a birthday.
The question about this.
The state constitution says that judges cannot serve after age 70, but if they're elected before they're 70 and they turn 70 in the middle of their term, they get to finish their term. Marullo was elected under before the 1974 Constitution. He was elected under the 1921 Constitution, which had a 75-year-old age cap. So he wants to take advantage of that and ran for office. He was challenged, and the court ruled that he was eligible to run because the Constitution says you cannot serve. So they specifically said, we're going to leave this open for later. We're not going to rule on whether or not he can serve. We're just going to say he can run. His birthday is on New Year's Eve, and I think he said once he was born like 2 minutes before midnight. So if he'd been born 2.5 minutes later, this might not be an issue. But no one yet has challenged him. He's 76 years old. His term began 2 minutes after he turned 76, but he's been sitting on the bench of criminal court. To my knowledge, and I checked before the show started, no one's aware of any challenges that have been filed. And basically, he's going to serve until the Supreme Court, the Louisiana Supreme Court, says he cannot serve.
But Frank Marullo remains on the bench right now over at Tulane and Broad. Okay, yes. Clance, thanks a lot. All right, Naomi, over to you. You wrote a great piece about the murder rate went down for the city of New Orleans for year 2014. But not everything dropped. Not all rates dropped. I mean, violent crime rates did not drop.
Right. We saw large increases in non-fatal shootings this year. Last year there were 150 murders, but there were nearly 400 people who were shot and survived their wounds, which is a 25% increase from the year before in non-fatal shootings. We also saw huge increases in armed robberies and simple robberies, close to 40% more armed robberies last year. So, you know, people are rallying in the French Quarter about, you know, their concerns about violent crime, and The NOPD Chief Michael Harrison is saying that he hears people's concerns about the unsafe streets, and he's adding more, overtime for cops and creating this new violent crime task force to try to target hot spots. So we'll see if that's successful.
Naomi, the point about surviving their wounds, that's a point that you make in your article, which is very interesting, that one reason that they're giving credit is because of the new medical technology, because of Afghanistan and Iraq and the wars, that would have learned about survival tactics.
Yeah, basically in the wars, the American military learned that there are some ways to sort of prioritize vital organs as opposed to trying to save someone all at once. They just try to save their vital organs, basically, as well as, immediately putting direct pressure on the wound and just trying to stanch blood loss as much as possible. And getting people blood immediately as opposed to other sort of liquids that they used to, EMTs and paramedics used to put into victims. So that has been pretty successful. It's been credited with saving a lot of lives around the country as well. Here at the trauma center at Interim LSU Hospital, the head of the trauma center is Dr. Norman McSwain, and he's actually a retired Air Force military doctor, and so he brought those tactics he's like at the forefront of that research. He brought those techniques into the trauma center as well as New Orleans EMS, and they've been seeing a lot of good results from that. They said last year that they had 19% of gunshot victims die in 2012, and then in 2013 it was down to 14%. They're still calculating their numbers for 2014, but they've been doing the same things, so we should have those numbers soon and see what improvements they've made in saving more lives.
So in the reduction of the murder rate, the city attributes that to the success of NOLA for Life. So why don't you quickly explain to us what is NOLA for Life and how is it helping in reducing the murder rate?
Yeah, NOLA for Life, it's basically premised on ideas by the national criminologist David Kennedy. They've been ideas that have been put into place in other cities and been credited with having success. Basically, they target gang and group members who are usually young males who are believed to engage with each other in retaliation and violence, and they go by this no snitch code where they don't cooperate with police no matter what. They'd rather go to jail, and so it's very hard for authorities to crack these gangs. So what they've been doing is through NOLA for Life, they've identified 900 alleged gang members in the city, 50 groups. And they are telling them, they're basically calling them in, one or two groups at a time with the U.S. Attorney, the mayor, the DA, all these heavy-hitting, leaders. And they say, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, you need to stop. The community will not stand by this anymore. And they basically give them a choice between either go to jail or, you can take our help that we're offering, and they offer them help with getting jobs, getting education.
Are they taking the help? Are they accepting this?
The city says that they've seen some success with that. About half of the people that they've called in so far have signed up for services. They called in about 230 people. 108 took the services and then signed up for services, and then now about 50 still remain in services. Even 2 are actually in college now.
And also the multi-agency gang task force is another thing that
right,
is
and that
employed.
And that's actually David Kennedy says that this is a model for the rest of the country, the one in New Orleans, because it's federal and local prosecutors and police and FBI agents, and basically they are building these very strong cases against these gangs that carry very heavy prison sentences, and so it's a very effective strategy in terms of following through on these threats. But they've already indicted, I think, 11 groups, and I think about 100 people are now in jail because of those. So it makes a big splash when they do them, and I think the city says that these groups are taking notice that the rules have changed and they can't get away with the same stuff anymore.
And these cases are both in federal and state courts. And while our murder rate has come down, we're still, 31 per 100,000?
We're around 39 per 100,000. Just to give you an idea, that's 11 was the number for the national average for cities in our category of size. We're still more than double Chicago's rate, more than double Atlanta.
Per 100,000 population.
Per 100,000, yeah, right, per capita rate.
Yeah.
I still think the big picture is the one that you don't see, and by a lot of people believing that education is improving, and in the long run that's going to account for the decline in the rate too. So.
Right, but graduation rates improving too.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Naomi. Okay, it's carnival time, Errol.
Yeah, I got to tell you, this Mardi Gras will be the 10th Mardi Gras since Katrina. And I think that's significant because I remember the first Mardi Gras after Katrina when there were a lot of people who were saying there shouldn't be a Mardi Gras celebration. And if you recall at the time, the world's news media were camped out in New Orleans waiting to report on the death of New Orleans. And had there not been a Mardi Gras celebration that year, I think that's a story that would have gone out. I regard of all the Mardi Gras celebrations, the Mardi Gras 2006 is the most important ever because one, it showed the world that we're still alive. But equally important, it showed the people who live here that we were still alive too, and people were able to go out and celebrate. A lot of the crews were at half capacity at that time, but I remember Mardi Gras Day itself was an absolutely beautiful, cloudless, 72-degree day, and I think that did a lot to at least trigger the spirit in New Orleans. It had a lot of value to the carnival. Carnival is still growing. It's changing though. Some ways good, some ways bad. The geography is different. It used to be that carnival parades were dispersed all across the community. Now just about everything is along St. Charles Avenue. The one exception in New Orleans being Endymion. Endymion goes wherever it wants to, and it wants to along Canal Street. But the police have wanted to have the parade routes more standardized, and so pretty much everything goes along St. Charles. And there's no more single parades. There's all double headers and triple headers. And there are some nights that used to be kind of like so-so nights that have become Bacchus-sized nights in terms of crowds, like that Friday night with the Coup d'etat and Hermes, which are very popular. That Thursday night with Muses, which has become very popular along with Babylon and Chaos. And so some nights have become very popular. The geography has changed. The other big change, though, is there are more women involved in Carnival than before as riders and participants. There's always been some female crews, but I think the creation of Muse has just brought on, it came on at a time when women had become such a dominant part of the professional workforce. It just brought in a whole group of new players in the Carnival. It has caused so much excitement that you've seen Nix develop, which is a spin-off, and you see two new crews that have developed. The suburban Mardi Gras in Jefferson Parish has declined. We saw a parade drop out this year. But the good thing is that the part of the decline is because Jefferson Parish is getting tough on the regulations. And to parade in Jefferson Parish, you got to put on a good parade now. And I think Jefferson Parish took the right step. And in the long run,
it actually made Carnival stronger in terms of the qualitatively, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. In the long run, that's going to be for the embedment of the Jefferson Parish Mardi Gras. And so I applaud them for really doing the right thing. So fewer parades this year will mean more quality parades down the road.
And parades get going when? In just a couple of weeks or so?
Mardi Gras is the 17th, and so a couple of weeks before that.
Back from then. Yeah. And okay, of course, Napoleon Avenue is all torn up, so that's going to be something we'll be talking about, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. Okay, thanks a lot, Errol. Stephanie,
yes.
A hearing today in Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals regarding gay marriage. Explain that to us. Okay. What's going on there?
This was the appeal of Judge Feldman's ruling. He was, remember, the first district. These cases have been going on all over the country. The local judge here, Judge Martin Feldman, was the first district court to basically uphold a same-sex marriage ban, Louisiana's, which, by the way, was authored by Steve Scalise, if you go back in time. And so it was a hearing basically on Louisiana's law, Texas's law, and Mississippi's law, which are all basically the same, and the arguments are the same. It's equal protection is really the question. Can many judges across the country and most appeals courts that have ruled on it so far have said that these same-sex marriage bans are unconstitutional. They violate the right to equal protection because they discriminate, they deny certain rights to same-sex couples. It's a big problem to have this patchwork now because it's legal in many states, not in others. So if people move, then their rights are in question. It's a mess, parental rights, taxes, there are all federal benefits, there are all sorts of issues that are very complicated, and really what's going to happen eventually is the Supreme Court will decide. What happened in the Fifth Circuit, it's the most conservative, it's considered the most conservative district court, but there's a 3-judge panel, And it was interesting because there was a conservative and a liberal and a guy who basically was Anthony Kennedy, or the local version of him. Everyone was arguing to him. Judge Higginbotham from Texas, and he's a Reagan appointee, a Republican, but someone who's considered not an ideologue. And from the questions that the judges asked, it really did sound like they were somewhat skeptical of the state's arguments that these bans are constitutional. Back to the Supreme Court, the other thing that could have happened today that didn't is many states have asked the Supreme Court to finally deal with this once and for all. They had a meeting today where they could have decided whether to take up some of these cases. They did not decide one way or the other. So
they didn't. They just deferred it.
They deferred it. It could come next week. It could not. It's the Supreme Court. You don't know.
What about a ruling from the Fifth Circuit?
We don't know. Whenever they hand it down.
We don't know if they even will,
yes.
Because it might be in the Supreme Court.
It might be preempted.
Yeah.
So, but it was same-sex marriage proponents emerged from it very encouraged.
All right. Thanks a lot. All right. It is time now, folks, to look ahead.
Okay, well, if you're going into football withdrawal after a very disappointing football season, arena football will be back. The Voodoo are returning. They literally kick off on March 28th at the arena against the Jacksonville Sharks. So a return of football in a couple of months.
Okay. Clancy.
Well, after our discussion about Judge Marullo, I think I can't predict what's going to happen, but there's certainly going to be kind of a quiet vigil to see if someone files a challenge there. Because imagine someone who gets an adverse ruling in his court, they might then feel that they have standing to say, wait a minute, this judge who ruled against me isn't qualified to serve, and that could serve as a basis. But I think it's only a matter of time. I don't know when. It might be next week. It might be 6 months from now. But I think there will be a challenge to his continued sitting on the bench.
All right, Clance. Naomi?
A lot of people might remember the killing of a 5-year-old girl during a birthday party a few years ago in Central City. That case is one of the first gang cases to go to trial, which is set for Monday. The gang is called the 110ers. It's going to be the first multi-agency gang unit case to go to trial in state court. So,
and how many individuals are going to be on trial?
It's 4 people, but there was a whole bunch of others who have already pled guilty and agreed to testify against them.
All right, Naomi, thanks. Steph?
And if you're having withdrawal from campaigning and politics, we have a governor's race this year, and it's only January, but the first forum is next week, actually, with all 4 confirmed candidates: David Vitter, Jay Darden, Scott Angel, John Bell Edwards. They'll be meeting before a trade group in Baton Rouge, and it's the first, it won't be televised, unfortunately, but it's the first time we'll kind of get to see how they go after each other, present themselves. It's going to be a long year.
We'll have a lot of chances to catch us over the course of the year. Thanks, guys, for being here, and thank you all so much for joining us. And of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.